Welcome. Today I'm interviewing two poets and scholars, David J. Rothman and Susan Delaney Spear. When young, David Rothman had the good fortune to study with Czeslaw Milosz, Derek Walcott, Seamus Heaney, Mark Strand, and Robert Fitzgerald. His most recent books are a textbook, Learning the Secrets of English Verse, and My Brother's Keeper, a finalist for the Colorado Book Award in Poetry. In 2019, he won a Pushcart Prize for the poem Kernels, which originally appeared in the New Criterion. From 2009 to 2019, he was the director of the poetry concentration with an emphasis on form in the MFA program at Western State College of Colorado. Susan Spear taught English and creative writing and poetry at Colorado Christian University in Lakewood, Colorado from 2011 to 2022. She earned her MFA from Western Colorado State University in 2012. Since that time, her poems have been published in many print and online journals. Beyond All Bearing, Whiffenstock, is her first collection, and On Earth is her recent one. Along with David Rothman, she is the co author of Learning the Secrets of English Verse. She now lives in Tampa, Florida, and you can find her at susandelaneyspear.com. So, welcome, David and Susan. Great to have you on.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
I've never interviewed two people at the same time, so we'll see how this goes. But there's a lot to talk about here. I'm thinking we could start off by promoting your recent textbook, Learning the Secrets of English Verse, Keys to the Treasure Chest. So maybe you could each talk a little bit about what inspired you to collaborate on this project.
Well, it was actually Susan's idea. I had developed a curriculum that I wrote for the program, the MFA program at Western, based on my many years of interest in the subject, and especially on what I learned from the great poet, translator, and teacher Robert Fitzgerald as an undergraduate. And what I had done was taken his class on versification, which was taken by many poets whose names you'll recognize: Jackie Osherow, Dana Gioia, Elise Passion, Brad Lighthouser. And I took it, to me, it was an utterly transformative class. And I took that and wrote my dissertation at NYU on prosody and versification. In fact, on the prosody and versification of free verse. And then over the years, kept on working on this and eventually had the opportunity to design this MFA curriculum. And I was discouraged by so many other curricula in the field. And so I developed something that was an extension, to the best of my ability, of what Fitzgerald had done. Very, very rigorous, thoughtful about how it progresses from metrical, the study of meter and rhyme, into the study of the lyrical genres, into dramatic poetry, narrative poetry, the question of the relation of poetry to music. And Susan was one of the early students in the program, and obviously has had an outstanding career. She's publishing very, very widely. And at a certain point, because it was mostly an online program, low residency, we called it, with a residency in the summer, but the rest of it done like this online. I had to write out a lot of the material, at least in notes, for the students. And at one point, I made the passing comment, I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, Susan, that, oh, we ought to just turn this into a textbook. And she just wouldn't let that go. And she harassed me. I should probably file a suit. She harassed me and finally got me to do it. So I wrote that up. But then she also had this brilliant idea, utterly innovative and brilliant, to actually use the poems of students. And we then had this tremendous opportunity, because she was teaching in the Chatwith public schools, for me to go in there and work with her and teach these high school students, and then to take their exercises, and we got their permissions. They're now probably all in their 30s, to incorporate their wonderful exercises into the book. So you not only have Shakespeare and Sappho and Browning and Emily Dickinson, which are obviously impossible targets for students to hit, really. It's strange that we say, oh, just write like Shakespeare. Well, of course, it's useful to do that, but we also then provide them with student work and analysis of it. This was Susan's idea, and put it all together, and I wrote and wrote and wrote, and she wrote and wrote and wrote, and we edited and wrote and wrote. And then Susan went out and found this wonderful publisher, a world-class publisher, Springer. I calculated at one point that it was literally 10,000 times as large as any small press I've ever worked with. I think they have 100,000 books in print, maybe more. And we got it done. It was a very long, complicated process because as a textbook, it's difficult because it has all these scansion marks that are really challenging to proofread. So that was sort of the inspiration. The inspiration was both of our teaching, both of our writing, both of our hard work, and then work with the students themselves and the belief that there was a real need for something like this. Susan.
Well, from my perspective, the real need was inside me. And I was an English major in undergrad, and I remember asking my professors if they could explain to me the physics of lines of poetry. And nobody could. And that was in the 70s, of course. And they were wondering why I wanted to know those things when they were horribly out of fashion at the time. And so nobody was very helpful to me. But one professor gave me an examination copy of a book called An Introduction to Poetry Through Writing by a man named Louis Turco, who had written some other books on form. But this one actually gave you examples of the form and exercises. So I tried to do it over a summer, and I had a professor that I showed these things to, and I got some credit for it. But what he said to me at the end of the summer was, you express your creative side much better in visual art and in photography than you do in poetry. This is so green. And when I go back and look at that notebook, he was right about the content, but he was completely wrong about the form. I was hearing the meter, and so I was looking for that, but I left feeling very dispirited that perhaps I could structure this, but I'd never be a poet. And so some years passed, and I was raising children, and
So not like a regular mom. I'm a cool mom.
they were getting older, and I was teaching in public high school at that time. And I saw this advertisement for a class at Lighthouse Writers Workshop, which was before the MFA program.
In Denver.
Yeah, in Denver. And it is thriving, going great. Now, perhaps you've heard of Lit Fest that happens every summer. And at the time, it was a fledgling organization. And I saw this class introduced with this man named David J. Rothman about the forms of verse. And I thought, maybe I'll give this a try. It sort of looks like what I've been looking for a long time. And it, in fact, was. And I met some friends that I still, talk with about poetry and meet with regularly. But we were online because David was living up in the mountains. And then after a couple years of taking those classes, I was learning a ton and writing all the time. And I decided to look up David J. Rothman online. And I thought, holy cow, what have I found? This guy went to Harvard, he studied with these people, and I'm getting this nuts and bolts stuff. I'm not in a touchy-feely workshop where people are saying they don't like the idea in my poem. I'm really learning. And so then when he started the MFA program, I desperately wanted to be part of that. And probably I wouldn't have gotten in a established program because my work still wasn't very good. But after we started working, I just had this idea that this has to be a book. The way his curriculum was laid out, I knew it would make a difference to students in the way they approached poetry and the way they looked at it. So it was the spring before the MFA program started. I got a grant at the high school for writers in the schools, and David came one day a week and he presented verse forms. And the kids wrote these exercises, and that's the foundation of the book. That's where we got the exercises. So that's how it kind of all fit together. With a lot of pestering and a Hurry up, David, as he was working on many other projects at the same time.
Well, thank you both for that so much. Yeah, I mean, reading this book and learning about your program that you were teaching, my first thought was, I really wish that I knew this like 10 years ago. That I wish that there was somewhere I could have gone.
I wish you did too.
If I'd known about it, I would have applied. But yeah, I'm so impressed by the book. It's just the level of rigor is something that I've never seen in a textbook before, like this. And I've read several, and I've read handbooks. I'm a big fan of Stephen Fry's handbook. It's just mostly because it's just very witty.
It's extraordinary. It's not systematic, really, but he's very charming and really quite knowledgeable. It's really quite a good book. It's one of the 4 or 5 really good books out there.
Yeah, so but this is just on a whole nother level. And so I'm hoping we can maybe raise the exposure of it a little bit here. And I'm very curious to know more about your professional careers. And David, your author bio on Amazon is quite long and impressive. You have many achievements under your belt. Can't get to all of them, but just starting with your stint at teaching this program for a decade at what, Western Colorado State College, is it?
Well, it's gone through a number of name changes. The graduate school is now called Western Colorado University. Began as a normal school 120 years ago. First taught classes in 1911. It slowly developed into a university, and there were various name changes and so on. But there, I taught in the undergrad programs for a number of years because my wife and I raised our family in the town of Crested Butte, Colorado. We left New York City, where we've been living together and working while she was a professional ballet and modern dancer at a high level, and I was a grad student at NYU and taught there. And I got a job helping to run a prep school out there. I wrote that curriculum. That was my first experience writing a core curriculum for a ski academy, basically, a college preparatory school. And I learned about the college, and I wound up then teaching there composition and English classes, sort of as an instructor. And then eventually, I became friendly with this fellow who was a very fine poet, Mark Todd, and a wonderful guy. And he's the one who got this MFA program started, and he asked me to write the poetry curriculum. So I ran the poetry concentration for a number of years, and then when he left, I became the second director of the full program for another 5 years. So I ran the poetry concentration for a decade, and I ran the full program for about 5 years. And it's a very interesting MFA because it focused on popular genres, screenwriting, writing for television, genre fiction, which is sort of a redundancy because all fiction has a genre, but meaning popular genre fiction. And the people they were just great, especially my dear friend Russell Davis. We had this strange concentration which is utterly different from almost every single MFA program out there, exception for very few, like James Matthew Wilson's, on a very rigorous approach to the craft of verse. I don't teach poetry, I teach verse. Poetry is not a technical term. We use it colloquially, of course, to mean a particular way of writing. But what you really need to learn how to do is to write verse. And then, if it's poetry, the world will decide. Because that's what we do. We write verse, which is really quite different from writing prose. Even though prose is a form of verse. Did you know that? Do you know the etymology of the word prose? It's pro plus versus. It's contraction, meaning a verse that only turns forward. It doesn't turn back. So it's all verse, all the way down. It's turtles all the way down. It's verse all the way down. And that was sort of the genesis of that program. And that gave me a tremendous opportunity to implement the curriculum we talked about earlier. That's what we were trying to do. And did it for a number of years. And there were about, a dozen graduates over those years. And most of them are doing pretty well.
Breathtaking. I shall call him Mini-Me.
Susan Tialan Go, who has a new book coming out, very talented. A number of the others have published books as well. Josh Williams, Erica Reed.
John Steele.
I think John Steele.
I think Brian Palmer has a book coming out.
Oh yeah, and Brian Palmer editing the journal Think. We have the journal Think, which I think has turned, frankly, Susan and I edited it together, and Christine Urick started it and did a great job. We managed to take it to another level. It became a perfect bound journal. And now Brian Palmer is editing it. He's one of our former students, and he a very good writer, very good poet. And the university de-accessioned it. I think that's the term, and he now runs it independently. And it's a truly excellent journal. The lead poem in the current issue is by Tim Steele. Fred Turner is there all the time. Lots of others. Wendy Bitlock. And we had a wonderful summer writers conference called Writing the Rockies that Mark Todd had founded, and it was really quite strong, and so on and so forth. There was a lot going on. We had a libretto workshop where students wrote libretti, and then I got musicians to perform them. They would find composers. Susan did this with a very wonderful libretto. So it was very exciting for a while there.
Great, great. Um, Now I was curious, you said that you'd had difficulty acquiring students. How did you get your students? Did you know them previously? They just reach out to you?
Would offer to buy them drinks and tell jokes, and would offer them. I don't know. I taught at Lighthouse. A number of students came from Lighthouse. And I knew a lot of people in that world because I've been very involved with it at Westchester University, that wonderful conference co-founded by Dana Joy and Mike Pike in Pennsylvania. AWP, I was involved with that, and so on and so forth. And we did everything we could, but it was an isolated school. It didn't have much in the way of an advertising budget. And of course, you have to reach a very particular group of people, and it's hard. As Susan said, she came from Lighthouse Writers Workshop in Denver, where I taught for many years. It was very hard. But those who came were very talented and very motivated. We had quite a good group.
The students who were studying with me in the time that I was there are all still continuing strong in the poetry world in some fashion. Whether they're writing or teaching or editing, they're all still involved in poetry.
I'm glad to see that people are carrying on your work, David.
I already had someone created in my image.
I'm given to understand that this program doesn't exist or still exists, but it's altered since you left. Somebody else took over.
Well, we had an amazing faculty. Julie Kane, who is still there, and David Yezi and Ernest Hilbert. Really gifted people. It changed when I left. I think they wanted to become more like other MFA programs to attract more students. So as a result, they de-emphasized what we had done. There's still some work like that being done there. Julie Kane and Tyson Hausdorfer, who are both very talented. But Julie's retiring, I believe, at the end of this year.
That program was so rigorous that in the evenings, the fiction writers and the screenwriters would say, "I'm sure glad we're not in the poetry concentration," because they knew we were going back to our rooms to write and write and write what we had to show the next day.
Yeah, I read that curriculum that was attached to your essay, and I was just flabbergasted by how rigorous it was. But if it didn't last forever, at least it lived for a time.
Well, and now we have this textbook. That textbook covers one course for one semester. How many courses were there, Susan? I guess 12. No,
8,
no, 8,
10,
10, 11. Yeah, but then there are the summers.
3 summers,
2, 4, 6, 8,
so
10 or 11.
11, and a thesis.
Yeah, and that curriculum covers just one course.
What I'm hearing is that there's maybe 9 other textbooks out there potentially, sequels yet to be written.
Only Susan bugs me a lot.
Yeah, yeah. And I couldn't help him with the other 10, so
Sure you did. You did them all.
I don't know. I did, but not this in-depth.
Well, Susan, I'm curious about your own professional teaching career as well. So, unlike David, you have taught at the high school level in addition to the college level. And I'm particularly interested in your experience doing that. Like, what's the major difference between teaching poetry to college students versus high school students?
Well, I had a rather charmed existence as a high school teacher because in a matter of a few years, I ended up being an instructional coach. Half-time is somebody who coaches other teachers, and half-time AP Lang teacher. So I got to work with adults, which was delightful, but I also got to teach the cream of the crop as far as students who were interested in the English language. So what ended up happening is that I just didn't give these kids a choice. when I began teaching AP Lang, I said it was the same time I was studying with David at Lighthouse. And I wanted this book to come out so much. That's when I wrote the grant for Writers in the Schools and started teaching verse forms once a week in my AP classes. So the kids were up for anything because they were kids who wanted to learn no matter what it was. They were the kids who were taking calculus and AP physics and, European history and all the hard courses. So I had these great students and I said, hey, this is what we're going to do. And they said, okay.
Reading is good.
Now, did they all like poetry? No, but they did by the end of that semester.
Mom, can you pick me up? I'm scared.
The pushback that I got, interestingly enough, at the high school level was from a few parents who thought their students weren't going to be ready to do well on the AP language test. The scores actually, in fact, went up because learning about verse forms and language and the nuances of meter and how to look at subordinate clauses in a dense piece of poetry and that sort of thing just made their skills sharper. So not only did they end up having a lot of fun writing their own poems, many of which you see in this book, their AP Lang scores went up. When I got to college, I also had a pretty wonderful bunch of students. It was at a small liberal arts Christian school, and we had maybe any one time about 60 English majors from freshman to senior, but they were the best kids in the school because they were the students who wanted to learn how to think, who wanted to read, who wanted to write. They were not all convinced about verse forms. And I just said, fine, you don't ever have to write in verse again, but you do in this class, and you will understand why, and then you can write whatever you want. And I think about 75% of them really bought into it by the end of the semester. There were always a few students who said, I feel really hemmed in by this. And I said, fine, you're only hemmed in until May. No problem. Then we cut you loose and you do whatever you want to do. So I just didn't give them a choice, but I did it with good humor and they were okay. I would say, though, that it was a rousing success. One of my high school students is living in Brooklyn, and she's published a book. That's the only one that I know of. From my college students, there are maybe 5 or 6 that are continuing to write and are actively publishing in good journals. I woke up one morning and opened Autumn Sky Poetry email. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not. Sometimes they're informed, sometimes they're not. But it's an online journal that publishes a poem a day. And I thought, oh, Vitalia Straight, that's my kid. There she is on Autumn Sky. So, I sent her a note, and I keep being delighted with things like that. So if I have 5 or 6 kids from the 10 years that I was there, that seems to me like pretty good odds.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for that. See, now, David, I'd really like to know what it was like studying under all those famous poets at Harvard, Heaney, Walcott, especially Robert Fitzgerald.
Very well. Where do I begin?
I was deeply committed to this path from a very early age.
My childhood was typical.
And I was at Harvard at a time which, in the long and storied poetic history of the institution, may have been a golden moment.
Summers in Rangoon, luge lessons.
When I was an undergrad, they were all teaching there at one time. Czeslaw Miłosz was giving the Charles Eliot Norton lectures in 1979-80. He won the prize on a day when he was giving a lecture, which was really like a class. And we all went in, and there was the Nobel laureate in literature talking to us. and his lectures became the book The Witness of Poetry. I didn't understand a word he said when I was there, but I knew I was in the presence of a great writer and poet. I could feel it in the air. And of course, now I understand far better what he was doing. And in my view, he dwarfed any other American poet I'd ever met, including Allen Ginsberg, who came by, who is a very fine poet and crazy, but very, very knowledgeable and very gifted and very difficult.
He would make outrageous claims like he invented the question mark.
But so Milosh was a brilliant lecturer. You really felt like you were in the presence of history being transformed into verse, historical consciousness. Although he could also be very charming and funny and witty. But I didn't really study with him individually, but I was in his presence and chatted with him. So he was a lecturer in what would now, I suppose, be considered an older European style. Seamus and Derek were, I mean, just stunningly gifted. This is before they won the prize. I think they were both great. I would say, I think Walcott had the most astonishing natural linguistic gifts of almost anyone I've ever met, but not teachers. They were there for their star power, and they were very charming, very gifted, very dynamic, but they had no curriculum and no pedagogy. And the same could be true of Mark Strand, who, although he didn't win the Nobel Prize, was obviously one of the strongest American poets working at the time. And I remember sitting there with them in class, and they just ran Iowa workshops. You know, somebody would put a poem on the table and it would get passed around, and then there'd be comments. And as gifted as they were, and despite the many brilliant things they said and how charming they all were, they didn't really have a way to teach what they knew how to do. Because in order to do that well, you have to have a curriculum and you have to have a pedagogy. And without that, you're not going to be likely to achieve what you would like to as a teacher. And then when I walked into Fitzgerald's class, I was just stunned. Because as a musician, especially, like as Susan is, I could feel that there was something that nobody was showing me and that was clearly going on in these poems. But of course, in the mid-'70s, when this was happening, late '70s, nobody was interested in it. And there were only 4 or 5 people teaching this stuff. Maybe Miller Williams at Arkansas, J.D. Cunningham, Brandeis, Lou Turco in upstate New York, maybe a couple of others, not many. And Robert Fitzgerald may have been the most rigorous of all because he was, of course, a very gifted, knowledgeable, subtle scholar of Greek and Latin and Italian, among other languages. And he was very genteel, of an utterly different school than I was. No one's ever called me genteel. I do my best. And I fail. And in any event, his course was just astonishing. He said, we will not be having a workshop here. This is a class on how to write verse forms. And his class included many of the forms that are in the chapters of our textbook. Stress-based imitations of classical quantitative forms, Anglo-Saxon strong stress meter, what he called riding rhyme, and what not only he, but Saintsbury calls it that as well, which is sort of an imitation of Chaucer and couplets, iambic tetrameter rhymed couplets, tripled meters, free verse, and then he also included things like he loved rhyme royal and the sonnet, so he would introduce these other Anglo-Saxon strong stress alliterative meters. I still use a lot of his material when I teach these things. And I'm honored. For some reason, I seem to be one of the very few people. I think Susan and I, our book might be the first one that actually introduces and explains and preserves the Fitzgerald system of scansion, which is an utterly brilliant innovation, utterly brilliant in many ways that we could talk about if we get into the technical side of things. But he was the one, he changed my life. I'd had wonderful teachers before that who had laid the groundwork, and many others after who were stunning. I mean, I really got to study with Harold Bloom, Dennis Donahue was my dissertation director, Helen Vendler, many others. But it was Fitzgerald who really set me on this path, and I wrote my PhD dissertation on prosody and versification, which is, when you're going out for an academic job, it's about like showing up at a dinner party and announcing that you're a leper and then inviting people to dance. It's very challenging, but that's what it was like. I mean, being around Strand, Milosh, Walcott, and Haney was a tremendous privilege. They were all very gifted people who did great work, but it was Fitzgerald who also, even though his own verse may not have been quite as well known as theirs, obviously, although his translations have sold millions of copies, It was Fitzgerald who had a pedagogy and a curriculum, and all of a sudden it all made sense. And I thought, there's a history, there's a system, there's a structure, there's a process, and it's possible to actually learn how to do this. So most of my pedagogical principles in this area and curricular principles and the structure of that entire textbook, as we make clear in the introduction, derives from his truly shining and marvelous example as a teacher. It was utterly extraordinary, and I think he had that effect on almost everyone who studied with him. And it's not surprising that a number of people who did became such strong poets and critics. He was extraordinary. And I frankly, I hope our book keeps his legacy alive. That's what I sought to transmit to my own students, albeit, as I said earlier, I'm not even remotely as genteel.
Now, Susan, what was it like studying under David?
Uh-oh. Ah,
Any embarrassing personality quirks we need to know about here?
no, none, never.
None. No, none. It was like drinking from a fire hose. And I finally figured out when I, after about a year, looked him up online where that came from. Both David's parents were in the academy. He grew up with the academy all around him. He's a true scholar and really loves what he studies and has a passion for sharing it. Probably more concerned with democracy in the classroom than I've ever seen in terms of paying careful attention to everybody and honoring all the students while still making the curriculum the main thing. If we felt afraid to share our exercises, we quickly got over that because we all wanted to get better so much. And we knew that what he was offering us was the way to get better. We knew we were practicing something we needed to practice if we ever wanted to have something on a piece of paper that somebody considered a real poem. This is what we needed to do. We needed to keep carving the marble, keep playing the scales, keep running the long, slow distance. And I don't know, I remember when I first started studying with him at Lighthouse, just how lights would go on all the time in my head, like something that the three of us know so clearly. He said one night, poets write lines. Prose writers write sentences, paragraphs. Poets write lines. And I thought, oh my God, why have I never thought about that before? And I remember writing that down and thinking this had been some amazing revelation. But to me, it had. So the way he was breaking things down and teaching us about these new forms and showing us not just this is iambic pentameter, but this is how it works. Yeah, you can have a trisyllabic substitution here if you want, but it won't work here. And yes, you can reverse the stress in the first foot, but it's probably much harder to do in the third foot. And those are things that nobody else, the technical things that nobody else, I was begging people to teach me and they didn't know. It was really hard, but I think not only I, but all of us appreciated that there was never a lowering of the standard, just a ladder to help us get higher and higher.
You want the moon? Just say the word and I'll throw a lasso around it and pull it down.
And during that time of the first couple years of the program, I also had the privilege of studying with David Yezi and Ernie Hilbert. I never had a class with Julie Kane. I wish I had. And they were wonderful too. So I am so grateful that I went through Western at the time I did.
It's very important to me, and I hope to my students as well, to pass on this legacy. But I also am painfully aware of how much more Fitzgerald understood about a number of things that I never will. He was obviously a tremendous scholar of Greek, and I have small Latin and less Greek. But I understand the concepts, and I did enough Latin to certainly understand what was going on. But to pass this on and keep it alive, it's important to understand it would have never completely died. But the numbers of people who were teaching this material in any coherent way were, if not infinitesimal, then close. J.D. Cunningham taught Tim Steele, Fitzgerald taught me, and Dana Joya and Jackie Osro and these other folks I've mentioned. And there were really not many of us. Now there are somewhat more, but of course it's still, you feel like Robin Hood in the woods or something. I'm going to AWP next week. Yeah,
You're going to
because
AWP?
I have a friend who's just started a journal, and she wants to go. She's never been, and I warned her. I said, it's pretty weird. And I was just looking at the program, and it's, what can I say? I was on the board. I did a full term on the board for 4 years, 2013 to 2017, something like that. And I was grateful to do that. But when I look at the offerings and the rhetoric and the organization, I did a global search through the entire schedule for the words verse and the word prosody, and each word appears once, and not in any way that's central to what's going on. Frankly, it seems like a gathering of slightly confused political activists. And it's just, we have to do what we do to the best of our ability, but it's still a small group of people who really pursue this with rigor and intent. I was talking earlier about Haney and Walcott. They could do all this stuff. Obviously, they're just, both of them, fantastically gifted. And Mark Strand too, but I remember in all these cases, a student would put something on the desk and you could see Walcott and Haney trying to figure out how to talk about craft with the student, and they knew how to do it, but it's very hard to convey it all at once. You have to have a progressive method, a curriculum, from kuro to run that moves from one thing to another in order to enable people to understand what it means to talk about generative metrics or the historical development of iambic pentameter and why we call it iambic pentameter and so on and so on and so on and so forth. And you could see the frustration in their eyes because they didn't even have a way to. So I'm very grateful. Susan passed it on to her students, and I pass it on to mine. And we hope it survives.
I would like to add, David, you said that you weren't genteel like Fitzgerald, but I bet he didn't have your sense of humor. David has an alarming sense of humor. And every once in a while in the classroom, in the midst of all this technical stuff, he'll express a pun or something that undoes everybody, but then he just plows right on, and we're still lost in the joke. The other thing he's able to do is go out for lunch and have several cocktails with his students and come back to a full plate of teaching, and everybody else is trying to keep up. So, yeah.
It gives me a rhetorical advantage.
Yes. But he's, alarmingly funny, even in the classroom.
Do my best.
You are teachers of poetry, but you're also published poets yourselves. So I was hoping to delve a little into that aspect of your work. We talked about teachers who've influenced your pedagogy. Who has influenced your verse style? That could be somebody you studied under or more classical figure.
Oh dear, that's a hard one. The poets who influence my writing are whomever I'm reading when I'm writing the current poem I'm trying to write. I try to read as many different kinds of things as I can, but I can almost not stand anymore to read things that aren't at least in the ballpark of metrical. It just bothers me. But I admire the brevity and the wit of Emily Dickinson and Kay Ryan, Kay Ryan strikes me as somebody who almost writes parables in verse. I admire Alicia Stallings. I was just telling somebody the other night how I appreciate how smooth Dana Joya's work is. There's no pretension in it. It's poems for the people, by the people, for the people. Beautiful verse. He has one called Summer Storm, but he still delves right at the heart of the things he's thinking about.
We live in a primitive time, don't we? Well, neither savage nor wise. Half measures are the curse of it.
He has a poem about Los Angeles. I think it was called Lament or Psalm for Los Angeles. This was before the fires. And it was just a beautiful poem, kind of in the style of Hebrew verse. just speaking about the vast spread of Los Angeles. And I do love Chaucer. I think he's funny. I think he's insightful to issues that were in the church. I really like George Herbert, Hopkins. So it's hard to even nail it down to one. I love it all.
Oh, yeah, it's interesting that you say that because my impression reading your collection on Earth is you had a variety of different things you're doing there. So that's admirable that you don't just stick to one main influence or a few.
Please stop talking. Okay.
What about you, David?
My answer is similar. People are unfortunately now or they think they are, they're not really, but they think they're so far removed from poetry that when they learn that this is the kind of thing you like to do, to make verses, as Robinson Jeffers said, I too make verses. They sort of stumble around for something to say and then say, well, who's your favorite poet? To which my standard response now is saying, like, that's like asking, which is your favorite tooth? We're taking away the rest. So I don't have a favorite tooth. I want them all to work. Like Susan, I've probably been influenced even by poets who I dislike. I think Ezra Pound was a wicked human being and an ethical, moral monster. And yet, for several years in the 1910s, he was clearly the most energetic and innovative poet writing in English, maybe in the world, both in prose and rhyme. And he was crazy. But you can't escape his influence. I don't think about it as my own personal influence. I want to know everything of note that matters. There are certain poets whose work I have really explored more than others, like Robinson Jeffers. I was the president of the Robinson Jeffers Association and its executive director at different times, because I think Jeffers is world poet. There's only one poet stronger than him in the history of American poetry. That's Walt Whitman. But the question is sort of easier to answer if you say, among the living, or in the 20th century, or in this country or that country. And among the living, Susan mentioned a number that I also admire. Whose work is going to last? Well, I think Haney and Walcott will both last. I think Miwash, my teachers, I definitely admired them, but I don't write like them. I don't write like Jeffers at all. I don't share his view of the world. He has a deeply tragic vision, a completely tragic vision of the world, which I admire and I think understand, but I do not emulate it. I don't quite share it, although I'm very sympathetic to it, philosophically and poetically. Among the living, I enjoy the poets who are gathered into certain communities around certain journals and institutions because I feel that I'm in conversation with them. One of them is my former students. Another is the poets associated with the Westchester University Conference, with Dana Joy and Mike Pycran. Another is the poets around journals like Think. I'd say the poets associated with the New Criterion and the Hudson Review. These are communities, I believe, of writers who share very broadly defined certain attitudes and approaches and backgrounds. I'm deeply influenced by the poets who I dislike, and that would include almost everyone else. Sorry, that's terrible. Without going into any names or so on. Of course, I subscribe to, I don't know how many journals, and I read them and I become sad, but I do read them. And of course, Susan and I, when we were editing Think Journal and when I've edited other journals, we would see thousands of poems just pouring across our desks, most of which inevitably we rejected. But you are, of course, affected by all of this. I think you want to be like a very, very fine column here. The poetry comes in and most of it goes through, and there are a few wonderful jewels left. It's like panning for gold. I could think of all sorts of contemporaries who I admire, and they don't all write the way I do at all. I hope not. Ned Balbo. I was editing for the journal Marginalia, which was published at Western for a while. It was a very good journal in its day. And I was just reading poem after poem after poem after poem, and then suddenly this poem appeared, bang, by Ned Balbo. I think it's called Sax. And I went, the rebel base is there. It was so obviously strong. Another time I had to judge the Frost Farm Poetry Prize. 900 poems. One winner. I did it in one day. My wife said, how do you do that? I said, well, you don't read the whole thing. I remember there was one poem that I started to read, and it said, the first line was, I swear to God, this is the first line. After you ate the pizza we ordered with anchovies, you vomited on my couch. And that was as far as I got. I then went, next, like this. I can't remember the name of the guy who won the prize, but two of the honorable mentions were by Aaron Puccinia, who's a classicist and absolutely gifted poet who has not received his due. And so we can just go on and on. Like, if I had to pick the poet who I think is not as decorated as he should be in America, who is absolutely world class, it would be Frederick Turner, who I think is magnificent human being, a gifted scholar and writer, an utterly innovative thinker, and a superb poet, a genius. He's amazing.
If you look at a great painting, its perfection is often the result of a series of studies, a prepared surface, a carefully revised set of pentimenti or underdrawings, often layers of corrective or enhancing brushwork. For the artist, this technical process involves a huge opportunity for deeply thinking through their conception, inspecting all of its implications, all of its correspondences with the artist's memories and dreams. The hard work of composing a formal poem has the same function.
He's one of the most knowledgeable people I've ever met. I have some very funny stories about him. He's truly a gift to humanity. I like to introduce him because the way I introduce him is I always say, Frederick Turner is unique in that his brain should probably be declared a national park. That's the way I like to introduce him.
He's written a couple epics.
Yeah, he's written 3. He wrote a book about epic, too.
If any book is worth it, that one is. It literally is probably the best thing ever written on the subject, as far as I can tell, in terms of its scope. He should win the Nobel Prize.
I think he has been nominated for the Nobel a number of times.
Oh, yeah.
And you've been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize how many times?
I think it's about 46 times, more or less. Various different countries.
Your rules are really beginning to annoy me.
Rena Espaillat deserves to be Poet Laureate of the United States. She's extraordinary. So there's a lot of good stuff being written, but as you can see my sort of orientation, I think one of the most wonderful contemporary poets I ever met, gone now, of course, was Allen Ginsberg, who was nuts. He was out of his mind and wrong about all sorts of things. But if you listen to his lectures, and I talked with him a lot. I met him a number of times, and I have some pretty funny stories about him. He was a lunatic. But Lionel Trilling said he was the best student he ever had at Columbia in his entire teaching career. And he was absolutely brilliant, and he pretended to be a hippie, but he was actually, boy, did he know his stuff. He had read everything. There's a lecture that's recorded somewhere that he gave about skeletonics that I think we may quote in the book. He read it all. He understood it all. He was utterly analytical about it, and he described it beautifully. He was really down in the weeds, and he was extraordinarily gifted. And I think at his best, I think Howl and In the Supermarket in California and Kaddish and so on, these are poems that are going to last. He would say, first thought, best thought, and then he'd write a completely obscene sapphic about having sex with boys in Boulder, Colorado, and it scans to a quaver. And it's not something that he just heard. You can't just hear a sapphic. He absolutely knew what he was doing. He was a very gifted man. So it's a hard question to answer, but there's, sort of an associative answer. I would say that the poet probably affected me the most when I was young as kids, although I didn't understand it at all. The great odes, when I read them when I was a kid, I thought, there's something going on here that's so musical and so beautiful and so thoughtful. I read those, and then Wallace Stevens, I had the same experience a little bit later. But that doesn't mean they're my influences, per se. They're just poets I love. And Shakespeare, of course, is probably the greatest writer in the history of the world, and then, along with the J writer of the Old Testament, which is why I think that it's very important to think of free verse as a form of verse, not a form of freedom. To study it, it's completely and utterly rigorous. Most people say they're writing free verse, and what people react against is that silly ideology, because they're not writing free verse, they're writing formless verse. Nobody claims to write that. Here's a very simple concept. Free verse can be doggerel, and almost all of it is. The great free verse, though, Walt Whitman, Robinson Jeffers, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, W.S. Merwin. Merwin, oh, what a beautiful writer. He shouldn't have published so much as he did, but at his best, he's absolutely spectacular, and he completely knew what he was doing. I mean, I could just go on and on and on forever because I'm sort of free associated, but maybe that begins to answer your question. I think people should read everything and learn what you can from it and be influenced by it all and look for the good, the true, and the beautiful.
Thank you for that thorough answer. Let's shift to some of your own work. David, you won an award for what, My Brother's Keeper?
I was a finalist for the Colorado Book Award for that book and for another one called The Elephant's Chiropractor. Elephant's Chiropractor is an early book, really, I guess it was my second. I'm not ashamed of it. If I ever have the opportunity to do a new and selected, I would pick a dozen poems from it. But it was a young man's book. It's really a collection of lyrics, sort of loosely organized. It was before I had learned how to write a book. Poets, when they're young, they just have so much verbal energy. There's a big difference between writing a poem and writing a book. And what I've learned how to do, I hope, aspiring to pursue the Virgilian Rotop, is to write larger and larger chunks and sequences. And Susan has done this very admirably as well with her poems about her son. But I really do believe that's what poets should aspire to do if they're ambitious as they grow older, is write books, not just write poems, although, of course, writing poems is fine in and of itself. So My Brother's Keeper is a sequence of poems. It's not very long. It's only 30-some-odd pages, which is basically a sequence that's an elegy for my younger brother, Michael, who died of a narcotics overdose at the age of 37. It was a breakthrough kind of book for me because I came to understand elegy more deeply, and I came to understand in a real way for the first time what it means to write a sustained sequence that runs through a very clear arc. So I hope the poems sort of stand by themselves, but they're clearly intended to be in this particular order. And the process of composition was pretty interesting. I've been writing these poems for years about my brother, and I literally woke up, not out of a dream, but out of a deep sleep at 3 a.m. with a kind of not a voice, but might as well, a clear concept in my head saying, all those poems about your brother that are on all these different manuscripts belong in this particular order. Go to your office and put them in that order. I did that, and I came back the next day and I went, where did that come from? I don't know. I didn't think about it or plan it. I would have never dreamed it up consciously. So that's what it is, and it moves from grief and anger and loss and regret to love and acceptance. It's a journey to love and forgiveness. I think Susan's had a similar experience with the poems that she's written about her son. Very, very difficult. If poets can't address these huge issues, what are we doing? Why would we trouble you for your time if you're not trying to say something that is utmost importance, even if it's funny or charming or apparently gentle? Nonetheless, it needs to have that resonance. That's what I try to do now, more and more.
Is there any of your own work that you'd like to read right now?
As I think you may know, my wife of 30 years passed away about 4 years ago. So I'm writing a book-length elegy for her, most of which are sonnets. And one of the interesting historical anomalies in the development of the sonnet is a lot of folks think of the sonnet as the poems that were forged in love, which they were, but they're also very deeply involved then in unrequited love. That's the famous phrase, right? But in the Vita Nuova, which is mostly sonnets and prose commentary, Beatrice dies, and there are elegies for her in that poetry. And then Petrarch's Laura, around whom the entire sonnet tradition was built, really, she died of the plague in 1348. And John Milton, I dreamed last night I saw my late espoused saint. That sonnet is, of course, an elegy to his wife, Catherine Woodcock. And there are many others. So the sonnet is also a form that's been used to memorialize lovers and spouses who have passed away. So here is the opening poem to this book called Orpheus Looks Back. And it's not apparently a sonnet, but in a number of ways it is. It's an unrhymed 18-line poem, but it's structured like a sonnet. Stroking out. It takes a while. First, speech slurs, but you can still write. Then, the writing goes, but you can still convey a yes or no by squeezing someone's hand. Then that goes, and there is a frantic motion, the eyes open, but it seems unseeing, though there's still a sense of need, a final urge for dignity, not to wet the bed. Then, at last, all motion ceases, but for Chain Stokes' breathing, and during this time, doctors say the mind stays clear. I held her in that final night, sleeping together one last time, drifting under the quiet, watchful care of friends, accompanying her as far as I could go, spooning at death's door, my face buried in her hair, one last time, holding the woman whose body had given both of us so much before it was consigned to the flames.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's a terrible thing, the loss of a loved one, but you can see in this case, as well as in Brother's Keeper, you're able to transform the tragedy into something beautiful, so that's at least something. Quote.
Elegy is one of the great purposes of poetry. You know, Auden famously said poetry makes nothing happen. There's another poet I admire. I think Auden will be remembered as one of the greatest poets of the 20th century. But the question isn't the right question. Poetry cannot make things happen. I think that's highly unlikely. But what it can do is provide the greatest and most profound possible testimony to what has happened. Witness, testimony.
Thank you, and we can get back to that collection on Orpheus in a little bit here, but for now, why don't we move to Susan? Susan, do you have any of your own work you'd like to share? From On Earth, or you have a previous collection too, Beyond All Bearing? I'm curious about how your work has evolved over the years too, between these collections.
Well, I think it's still in its nascent stages, to be truthful with you. My first book, about half of the poems were written before I lost my son, and he died by suicide 11 years ago. And then about half of the book were poems from that period or after that period. And so the first book was a book. I didn't set out to write a book. They were poems that I had written that I put together into sections, and the publisher accepted it. So I think I'm beginning to write perhaps more thematically, but also I am starting to write longer poems, more narrative, blank verse stories. I like to tell stories, and I like to tell them in verse. So it remains to be seen. I have about 30 or 40 poems since the second book came out that I'm pleased with, and they probably won't change. But I do sense that need to dig deep into something, and I'm not quite sure what that is at this point. My writing has also changed because I usually would start taking notes about something and then try to figure out what form that might be presented in, either in a comic way or a serious way or a fun way. And now I seem to find myself thinking about an image or a situation and spending more time delving into my own self and thinking, what was it about that image or that story that gripped me, and why do I want to tell it? And that seems to help me zero in more carefully. So I think that's how it's evolving, and I hope it continues to evolve. But from this book, since we're talking about poetic influences, I don't think this is my best poem, but I really like it because, well, you'll see. It's a true story. It's one of my stories I like to tell. Poetry 101. It must have been a Saturday, for Dad was in the living room coaching the Pirates from the old tweed couch. I, at the cantaloupe-colored kitchen counter, was reading Heidi and nibbling an ice cream bar. Dad had one eye on the TV and one ear on the transistor. Ali, Mazeroski, double play, 2 away. As Dad tuned in, I tried tuning out the cheering, moaning fans the strikes and balls, and Dad shouting, slide. Here at Forbes Field, the bottom of the ninth, the radio spit crackled. Dad yelled, swing! Silence groaned through Steel Valley. Dad stood, sighed, came my way, and said, well, there is no joy in Mudville, as he opened the brown fridge door and poured a glass of Coke. Dad, what did you say? What's Mudville? Mudville is the place where the mighty fall. I swear, the steel man's blue eyes shone. He straightened up his spine, sipped his Coke, and then, it seemed, he sang. The outlook wasn't brilliant for the Mudville Nine that day. His voice began robust. His hands danced in midair. I was stunned, then mesmerized. Dad's recitation rang like music through the screen up and down the street. And now the pitcher holds the ball, and now he lets it go, and now the air is shattered by the force of Casey's blow. It was the power of the rhythm and the pleasure of the rhyme and the utter surprise that this blue-collar dad, mine, had committed to his memory some 40 years ago a ballad of the Republic, a song of hope pinned on a hero. There was no joy in Pittsburgh, true. Roberto Clemente had struck out, but Dad had knocked it out of the park, and I'd been lit by that poetic spark.
So good.
Yes, thank you, Susan. So you've both had a lot of work published in journals. I'm curious as to your thoughts on some of that, because formalism, for people trying to get published, it's harder than for free verse journals, although it seems like there's certain journals that used to publish formal verse no longer do. Like I think Poetry Magazine used to be more open to that, and they don't do that at all anymore, it seems like. The last 10 years, or at least since, Christopher Wyman, since he
A
gave it
very
up.
fine poet.
Yeah. But last time I checked, there were maybe like 50 journals that publish formal verse. Is that about right, or is it more?
There are only a dozen that are really any good. It's serious.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Think is one of the best.
It is. Brian Palmer's doing a fantastic job.
Able Muse.
Hudson Review. Well, and then there's stuff online. Lighten Up Online and Light.
New Verse Review.
New Verse Review. Blue Unicorn, The Lyric.
A new one out of Australia called The Burrow. So there are a couple new ones springing up that have really fine verse in them.
Adam Kirsch is the poetry editor at the New Criterion. He has very good taste. The Hudson Review, of course. Those are probably the two most prestigious publications that publish metrical verse and rhyme. Then, of course, what's her name? Who edits Light?
Melissa Balmain.
Yeah, right. Melissa Balmain. She does a fantastic job, and Light is an absolutely wonderful journal. Well, and then there's Expansive Poetry Online. Art Mortensen, he does a spectacular job, and he's been very generous with me. And Susan, you published there too, right?
A few pieces, yeah.
We probably just hit most of them. That's 12 or 15, and that's about. There are some others, but in print, Blue Unicorn, The Lyric, Hudson Review, New Criterion, and online, Expansive Poetry Online, New Verse Review, Lighten Up Online, Think, of course.
The Hopkins Review.
Hopkins Review, absolutely, where David Yesley was editing for quite a while. I don't know if he's there anymore. We're probably leaving something out, but that's, what I have a standard response on this stuff. When people say, how do I get published? I've given so many of these talks. You sit there and all these people are looking and going, oh, how do I get published? To which my response is, ask not what poetry can do for you. Ask what you can do for poetry. Every strong poet I know, alive now, who I can think of, doesn't just sit in a garret and write poems and send them out and get published and kick back. They teach. They write book reviews. They edit. They publish. They write curriculum. They raise money. Don't underestimate that. Somebody's got to do it. They sit on the boards of nonprofits. and so on and so on and so on and so forth. Dana Gioia was the chair of the NEA, for God's sake. Talk about service. Dave Mason taught for decades at Colorado College. Alicia Stallings, a superb poet, obviously, is, Oxford professor of poetry. Everyone serves. It's a community, and the trick is to get involved. If you think there aren't enough journals publishing metrical poetry, guess what? Start one that meets a need that isn't the same as the others, whatever it may be. So I've done that, and Susan and I did it together at Think. We kept it alive. Christine Urich, God bless her, had the moxie to start this thing herself. We run conferences, we give talks, and so on and so on and so on and so forth. This all needs to be done. Somebody's got to do it. If you do all of that, you'll get published, because you will then wind up in a network and a community of people who care about the same things, which is the whole point, to further the conversation, not to just collect laurels. The point is to be part of a conversation that matters and live your life that way. Ask not what poetry can do for you.
Great response. I'm curious as to what the future holds for each of you.
Decline, decrepitude, and death.
See, David, you're working on this Orpheus collection here.
Yes.
Um,
Well, my wife, whom I love dearly with all of her complexities and flaws, along with my complexities and flaws, died of cancer in my arms about 4.5 years ago, at the age of 56. And, think about this. Here's something. If you're having a conversation with another person, an intimate conversation, and it's not being recorded, when the both of you die, no one will ever know it happened, unless somebody writes it down. It was as if a voice came to me and said, you just have to do this, because even though eventually the planet will be consumed in a conflagration caused by a nova, I simply cannot accept the fact that I'm going to let all that go. I'm going to do what I can, my little stay against the darkness, to commemorate my love for this beautiful, complicated, difficult person who I just adored, really, despite her many problems. Not to say that I don't have mine. Our problems fit together very well. So this is what an elegy is. Here, can I read you a poem? Here we go. It's just a sonnet. I'm rather pleased with this one. Here's why I wrote the book. The Song of Orpheus. The book's called Orpheus Looks Back. We could talk about why later. When these words lose their purchase and their sense, because time passes and they turn to mystery. When all our politics lose relevance, because time passes and becomes mere history. When the slate of our lives is wiped clean. When all the debts we worked so hard to pay have turned to dust. When even our obscene and horrifying wars have gone the way of mice. When our small star explodes and burns the planet to a crisp. When the entire cosmos collapses to a pointless point where matter, time, and energy expire. When all that happens, this will still be true. I loved a woman, and sometimes she loved me too. That's why I wrote the book. I just can't help it. It has to be written. Otherwise, it will all die with me, and I just absolutely refuse to allow that to happen. So I'm going to do my best. It's called Orpheus Looks Back because, of course, I came to understand the Orpheus myth much better after my wife passed away. Everybody thinks he's only looking back in space, but he's looking back in time. The myths survive because they're true, not because they're myths. Myth meaning false. And when a spouse dies in particular, but also anyone you love, a child, a parent, a friend, a sibling, everyone's had these dreams. You have this dream that you feel it's absolutely real. You're with the person. And then, of course, you wake and you realize that in your unconscious, the person is still alive and their spirit is still with you in some way, but they are physically dead. And when you realize that you have been looking back and then the person vanishes. This is Milton's vision in I Dreamed I Saw My Late Espoused Saint. And many others, many people. That's the Orpheus myth. He looks back into death because she's alive and she's fine. But as soon as you look back, as soon as you realize you're looking back psychologically, you also then become conscious. And when you become conscious, truth hits hard. So what I'm trying to do is not speak to people, because I'm hoping if people read it after I'm dead, they'll never know Emily and they'll never know me. I want to speak, as somebody once said of Derek Walcott, not to people, but rather for them, and to express as well as I can with my gifts the full range and panoply of emotions that are involved in the process of grief, which I think ultimately leads to love, gratitude, acknowledgement, and frankly, God. That's what sustains you in your ability to articulate and transmit such difficult things.
When can we expect your collection out?
They're appearing everywhere. The book is basically done. I keep adding one or two here and there, but the problem's going to be finding the right publisher because it's long. But it's really not a collection of poems. It's a coherent, integrated sequence it's like a memoir or a narrative poem, but there's lots of narrative in it, but it's written in obviously lyrics. So I'm trying to shape it and see if soon I'll be sending it out. Although I don't know who's even going to read it. We'll see. It's not exactly fashionable. I don't care.
In the spirit of the Renaissance, with your sonnet sequences and your classical allusions there.
Yeah, I'm not too interested in getting promoted. I want Petrarch to turn to me and go, hey, hey, not bad, kid. I want Dante to say, yeah, that's nice. I enjoyed it. I'm trying to get a blurb from Dante, but he hasn't responded.
You can ask him about it in the sphere of the poets. When you go there, you can talk to him.
I hope
You
so. No, but I'm being joking, but I'm rather serious. Donald Hall has this great essay called Poetry and Ambition, where he talks about this. And, the bottom line is I'd rather swing hard and miss than do anything fashionable.
Of course, what was fashionable was once an innovation, and then it became fashionable because people copied it.
Well put.
But, Susan.
Well, let me just say it this way. Yes, I have a couple dozen poems that I'm pleased with. Some have been published, some have not. That I'm starting to think about. The theme of pilgrimage seems to be emerging. But just this morning, I was jogging and I was listening to the New Yorker Poetry Podcast, and Kevin Young was talking to Jericho Brown, and Jericho Brown said, every poem is a love poem. So I came home and wrote that down and scanned it, and then I kept thinking to myself, then why are all of my poems touching on loss and death? And I think it's because it's all of the same piece. If you love something and it's missing, you grieve for it, or you look for it, or you search for it, or you feel incomplete. If you didn't love, you wouldn't have grief, and you wouldn't grieve if you hadn't loved. So I'm trying to dive more deeply and to understand that, and I have been ever since I lost my son. More about what that means and how that looks in the world. So I want to understand the world and the language in my own heart better so that I can express these things in a way that people will resonate with them. This is a lofty goal, but I would like to write at least one poem in my life that people remember the poem and they can't remember who wrote it. They just remember the poem. So I thought about this poem at the end of my second book on Earth. It's called Remains. In our garage, your hockey skates still dangle. Green and yellow parakeets still call from your painting on my office wall. Bright birds slowly dimming on a tangle of brown, twigless branches. A singing bowl, a book of Dylan's lyrics, a leather journal whose stiffening leaves I turn to read the kernels of your tunes, the jigsaw pieces of your soul. The Warwick bass you paid for by yourself. 3 joints you rolled that I will never smoke. A New Year's gift you gave me as a joke. And you, now dust and ash, rest on my shelf. Watercolors fade, ashes scatter, but love remains, firm unchanging matter.
Very powerful, thank you. Beyond your poetry collections, anything career-wise? Now, David, are you retired?
I always wondered about that word retired. I mean, does that mean you're tired again? I was tired yesterday, now I'm retired. I suppose I am. I mean, I don't have a day job. Instead of collecting benefits, I have Medicare, which is great. I encourage everyone to live long enough to get onto Medicare, because then you just go, wow, this is amazing. I have to give a lecture this week. I'm going to teach a class at a little private college here in Salt Lake on poetics using the textbook. It's called Mount Liberty College. It's a great place. I did a little testifying at the Capitol on an education bill last week. You know, I'm consulting and teaching at Lighthouse Writers Workshop this summer and fall a little bit. Just all sorts of little gigs, but I guess I am technically retired. But that just gives me time to do a lot of writing. And I am doing a lot of writing. The book for Emily, the 2 books for Emily, because there's one in prose as well. I have a book review that's terribly overdue. I have essays coming out on Wallace Stevens and on education. The main thing is just to try to get the stuff out the door and get it published. You know, I'm tempted. I see all these job ads cross my desk to run this and run that. But I'm trying to resist any temptation to go back into doing that, because the job now is to write. So that's what I'm doing. I would consider doing another textbook if Susan bugged me enough. Because she's great to work with. She's amazing.
Maybe we'll create a demand. People are going to want more.
Yes, that would
nice.
be wonderful. Yeah. If people were lining the streets yelling, prosody, prosody, prosody.
We need to know more about structural linguistics.
And
I can't live without it.
I am also retired, but I recently was drafted to be the interim organist choir director at my church, and it's supposed to be part-time, but it increasingly is eating away at my thoughts. It's getting easier though, but I'm trying to pick out music for the little choir that could, as I like to call them, and, you know, practicing preludes and postludes and things. But I'm having fun with that. And on every Monday night, I'm actually leading a group of people through this textbook. A couple people that I knew from Denver and a group of people that I met at an online poetry symposium, and they're the best group ever. One woman is a deputy editor at Wise Blood Books, and then 3 people that are really involved in the rattle poetry community that wanted to learn more about prosody, and 3 people from Denver. So that's been really fun, because watching them read this and tell me how effective it's been is really exciting. They know a lot of people in the poetry world, so they're plugging the book. So I'm doing that. I'm doing the music, and I'm trying to spend time every day writing. I have a book I have to have a blurb for. I'm just beginning to work on an essay for the symposium in the fall and things like that. I highly recommend retirement.
Susan, do they pay you for that organ gig?
Yeah, they do. I was going to do it for free, and the pastor said, no, you're not going to do it for free.
You know, if you did it for free, that would be fun, because then you could say you were an organ donor.
Ah, yes, I could. Yeah. You set that up there. See, I told you about his puns.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're both staying busy. That's good. Not one of the, I read that the baby boomer generation watches more television than any other generation.
Oh, no.
Writing is such a, you know, if you work hard and you're lucky and you live long enough and you manage to keep your health, the joys of having worked so hard to achieve what you can do when you get into your 60s is, it's hard to convey, but it really is worth it. I never imagined this in this way. I don't think most people do, and why would you when you're 25? But it sure is worth it, because it turns out you get better and you get a little bit wiser and you get more skilled with practice. And I'm right now trying to learn the transcription of an extraordinarily difficult Keith Jarrett tune called Personal Mountains that was transcribed by some brilliant Italian guy. At least he has an Italian name. And I'm just so grateful to have the opportunity to do that.
Well, Susan, will you be, among your list of projects, you forgot to mention starting the David Rothman Society here, too. to honor your former teacher.
I want to start the Susan Spear Society. You know, my father was an academic his entire life and a very, very good scholar. And he would look at me and he said, the greatest regret of my entire life as an academic is that I never had graduate students. And I never understood that until I had graduate students myself. Because graduate students aren't just students, they are junior colleagues. And to work with the people who I did have the opportunity to work with, and preeminently Susan, who I've remained the closest with, and obviously we've done a book together, is such a privilege and a joy. And I could have never imagined how wonderful it would be. And she is herself doing truly extraordinary work. And without her, this book wouldn't exist. So it's a great privilege. I want to start the Susan Spear Society. I think she should have named one of her children Shake, and then it would all have been.
Yeah, would have all. Yeah. Well, you can toss ideas about the next textbook my way. I pestered you for a long time for the first one. You can start sending me messages.
Well, I mean, it should just be another course. You know, obviously we don't need to do the lyrical forms, but I think lyrical genres.
You know what he said? When we started writing this, he said, it'll write itself.
What did I know?
It didn't exactly write itself.
Think about this. Everybody teaches, one thing that you don't really need to write much of a textbook on, although most of the books aren't very good, but the lyrical forms, right? I mean, the sonnet, the sestina, the villanelle, the ballade, that's all out there. But people act when they write poetry as if there's no genre. People say, what do you write? Well, I write poetry. Well, what kind of poetry? And they go, well, just poetry. But if you were making movies or writing novels, people would say, well, what kind of movies? And you would say, oh, horror, sci-fi, porno movies or something. I mean, you'd have these genres, right? Mystery. And when you turn on the tube or whatever, it's a thriller, it's a rom-com, it's a police procedural, and so on and so forth. There are all these subgenres. Same with novels. For that matter, with ice cream. Let's say you go to buy some ice cream and the ice cream vendor says, what flavor? And you say, oh, no flavor, just ice cream. Doesn't make any sense. And poetry has genres. Lyrical poetry has genres. The ode, the serenade, the love poem, the nature poem, the verse epistle, the philosophical poem, the epigram, like, and on and on and on and on and on and on and on. And nobody teaches them and nobody talks about them. It's one of the things we did in our program. I think it would be really interesting. The elegy, which we both read elegies, I think it would be quite interesting to have a textbook and to organize the study of lyrical poems, leaving aside dramatic poetry and narrative poetry and perhaps satire, and just to have a dozen chapters and say, look at these genres and how they've evolved over thousands of years, which they have. And nobody talks about that, and I think it's a real deficit in our poetic culture. So there's our next textbook.
Well, when I pitched this one to you, you said, put that in an email for me. So put that in an email and I'll get to work on it. Okay?
She's hard on me. She's a tough task mistress.
Sounds like great ideas, though. Yeah.
They are good ideas.
Yeah, it is a
Something
great
hasn't been done.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We can do it. We can do it.
Okay, hope to see it.
Do you know Elijah Blumoff? He does a podcast called Versecraft.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's called Versecraft, and he approaches craft through individual poems, and he puts a new one out every 2 weeks now, but he's a pretty good scholar, and his podcasts are interesting to listen to. They're about a half hour
I think
long.
you guys are about the same age. Aren't they about the same age?
Elijah's about 30, or about to turn 30.
You might be. How old are you?
40. Wait, what? I'm 40 something, 41.
Well, you're closer.
Sure.
Here's a good idea. The two of you should interview each other, and then you should both publish it on your podcast.
Yeah, there you go.
I think you and Elijah would get along. He's very charming, very bright, just like you. And I think and you're a very good interviewer and all that. Yeah.
And he's studied a lot of philosophy. And he's also a musician. He has a greatly wicked head of hair.
Yeah, you guys, the hair thing, you would deeply connect.
Yeah.
That'll be my in. I heard you have great hair. Right. Well, it's great been talking to both of you. It's been great talking to both of you.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Andrew, you're doing such a great service. It's so wonderful. It's such a privilege. I'm so grateful. I hope we get to meet, and we're deeply grateful to you.